get started here. We may have a few more people trickle in just based on the signups, but I think we can probably get started with the workshop. So we'll do some kind of introductions here. Just for those of you that kind of come in over the last few minutes, I'll point out a few resources that'll be really helpful during the workshop, and then we can kind of do a quick round of introductions. The video camera is running, so hopefully it really is just me that's being recorded, but if any of you would rather not be on video, just I guess don't walk in front of the camera. But so we'll get to this, if you go to the workshop page for Samvera Connect, just look up Samvera Connect 2018, you should find the page for the workshops. I just made a hyperlink for the title of my workshop. If you follow that, it'll take you to this page, which is a good place to be just for materials during this session. So I just tried to put together kind of a rough schedule. I guess first of all, there's preparation. So if you didn't catch my email that I sent probably a week or so ago, there's a link here to just download an application we'll be using for the workshop. It's a Java jar file. For most operating systems, you should be able to just double click it and run it, assuming you have Java 8 installed. You don't need the development environment, just the runtime environment. But if you'd like to follow along with the hands-on stuff, you'll need to have that up and running. So after we do some introductions here, I'll just double check to make sure anyone who needs that has got it before we kind of get going. And then I also, there's a little demo of a fixity check later, and it's I just uploaded a file that I'd already calculated fixity on, so it's a little bit easier to use, so you can pull that down later, but it's relatively small. The other thing is a lot of the exercises we'll be doing today would be kind of a mix of exercises through the user interface and exercises through, I guess, through command line using things like curl. So I'm going to be demoing everything, so if you're not super comfortable on the command line, don't worry about it, but if you would like to follow along, it'd be good to have a fully functional terminal. So if you're running a Mac, you've already got one. If you're running Linux, I probably don't need to tell you any of this, but if you're running Windows in particular, and you're not super familiar with command line stuff, I would recommend, if you don't already have one, more fully featured shell. So GitHub Desktop is kind of nice because it comes with like a Windows PowerShell. It's just handy because Windows doesn't come pre-built with commands like curl on the command line. So if you want to follow along with the hands-on stuff, it'd be useful to have that kind of more fully featured terminal on your machine. Otherwise, this is just kind of a rough schedule for the presentation. So this is a little bit of a prototype workshop. So the Fedora 5.0 isn't actually released yet. We're just on the cusp of putting out a release candidate, and so this is all very cutting edge stuff. And so are the materials. So most of the material in this workshop has never been delivered before. I tested everything out a couple of times ahead of time, but live demos are perilous. So we may encounter a few bugs along the way, which is always good to kind of pick up on and correct. But you're all experiencing this largely for the first time. So exciting stuff there. But yeah, that's the wiki page. And so what I thought I'd do to start off with, we're a relatively small group here, and it's always just nice to know kind of who's coming out and what you're interested in learning about, if anything in particular, so I can kind of keep that in mind throughout the workshop and try to kind of touch on some of those things as we get going here. So I'll introduce myself, and then maybe we can just do a quick round of the room, and everyone can just say who you are and where you're from, and just tell me if there's anything particular you're hoping to learn today, and that's just helpful for me. So for those of you that haven't met me before, I'm David Wilcox. I work with DuraSpace as the product manager, mostly for Fedora. I will say at DuraSpace we're doing a lot more experimentation these days around having people work cross projects. So I'm also doing a little bit of work on the Vivo project now, and some of the others on DuraSpace are also kind of working cross projects. So for now, full-time product manager for Fedora, but we are doing a lot more kind of cross-pollinating of our projects these days, trying to find ways for them to kind of work better together, which is always kind of a nice thing. So I do a lot of these sorts of things. A lot of my work is more on the community management side, so doing workshops, presentations, organizing user group meetings, fundraising, building kind of partnerships and relationships, and doing a lot of work just kind of with the community in general around events and things like that. So maybe we can just do a quick round of introductions. We can start here. sounds like everybody's kind of here to sort of see what's new and what's going on with Fedora. So that's pretty much what I had in mind with the presentation. So hopefully that lines up with your expectations. So we're pretty much right on schedule here. And as I said, we're kind of a small group, so as I'm going, maybe jumping back and forth between kind of slides and demo, but just put your hand up if you want to kind of stop me at any point and ask some questions. A lot of this stuff is pretty new for me too, so there might be some things that I might have to kind of make a note and get back to you on, but hopefully I can answer most of your questions as we get through the content. So one thing I forgot to mention is the agenda here is going to be really useful if you'd like to follow along. I basically just linked to the set of Google Slides that I'm going to be using for this presentation. So I'm not assuming that any of you are developers, although many of you are, and so there's not going to be any expectation throughout the workshop that you're going to be kind of writing code or anything like that. Anything that I'm asking you to do in the command line is copy-paste, so you shouldn't actually have to do a whole lot of typing into the terminal besides customizing things here and there for your file paths and things like that. But if the slides are going to be very useful to you in that sense because you can do the copy-paste operations because they're going to be right in front of you. Before I jump in here, is there anyone who was hoping to follow along with the hands-on stuff but either hasn't got the one-click application up and running yet or trying to get it up and running, had trouble? Now's a good time. I can take a break and just make sure that you're good to go, but otherwise, okay. All right, well, feel free to stop me. There's a break partway through if you want to have any help with this. Normally we do virtual machines for these kinds of workshops because the virtual machine is more than just Fedora. We add in a bunch of other external components, so it's a nice kind of ecosystem. Because this is pretty cutting edge stuff and 5.0 isn't released yet, we don't have a VM for it yet, so we're basically just running Fedora. But the nice thing is we have, and you can build this with a Maven command off the code base at any time, which is what I did. You can build a kind of one-click Jetty-based application that you can just run off of your desktop. It's a Java jar file. Hopefully all of you have that. You do need the Java 8 runtime environment to make that work, but otherwise it works pretty well, and it's fully featured as far as Fedora goes. So let me just jump in here, and I'll try to keep an eye on the time. So maybe I'll mention just at the outset here, because I don't think I've said a lot about it specifically in the slide. So there was a comment around kind of Fedora 5 and how that might be potentially a scary kind of move, especially since a lot of folks are still on Fedora 3 and Fedora 4 is still relatively new. And so I think one good thing to point out is that the reason we're calling this next release 5.0 is not because we've substantially changed the code base in the way that we did from version 3 to version 4. So 3 to 4 was a whole new code base, whole new application, and so we kind of rebranded it for Fedora 4. But then we weren't really following semantic versioning principles at that point, so every time we did a release it would be like 4.1, 4.2, but the 4 always stayed the same, even though by semantic versioning principles you should increment that first digit whenever you make major breaking changes. We were making breaking changes, but the 4 stayed in place. So technically, if we had been following proper semantic versioning, we'd be at like Fedora 11 by now, but we're not. We're at 4.7.5. So for the sake of sanity, we thought the release of this API spec, which I'm going to talk about, would be a nice time to also make just a cut to semantic versioning. And because we are introducing some breaking API changes, instead of making this Fedora 4.8, we're just calling it a 5.0. And then from then on, we're committing to a slower release cycle, no more than one major release a year, but as many minor and kind of security updates as we need. So if we cut a 5.0 this year, then next year you could potentially expect a 6.0 and then not a 7.0 to the year after that. But we're really just following basic semantic versioning principles. These don't represent massive shifts in the code base the way that it did from 3 to 4. So hopefully that puts some of your minds at ease about this kind of stuff, but I'll go into a little bit of what's going on here. So I mentioned this API specification. Fedora 4 and Fedora 3, but specifically Fedora 4 has a RESTful API. It has since its inception. It's well documented. You can go read about it. What we mean by specification is really kind of formally documenting the API and publishing it as a standard the way you would through W3C or the way IIIF publishes API specifications, that kind of thing. And the idea here is really to kind of think about Fedora not just as a product that you download and use, but also as its own standard. And so the Fedora API is going to be versioned separately from the underlying implementation. So we're going to cut a 1.0 API at the same time we do a 5.0 software release. And I'll talk a little bit about why we're doing that and sort of the benefits there. But then the idea behind this is that you can actually have alternate implementations that are still Fedora. So, and I'll talk about those kind of as we wrap up the workshop today, but different code bases that serve different needs, but that all kind of still communicate through the same API, and clients ideally don't know the difference, because your Samvera client or whatever client you're using can peg itself to the 1.0 API, and the API is likely to shift less often than the underlying code base, and so you can have a lot more stability on the client side. But if you'd like to take a look at the specification itself, I do have a link here. I'm not going to kind of go line by line through this workshop because that would be really tedious and boring, but this does give you just kind of a sense. It's actually fairly readable as far as API documentation goes, and I'll kind of cover the major sections of it as we do the workshop today and kind of show you a little bit about how each of these work. But we basically just broken it down into sections, and each one of these kind of describes how things work. So. So that's kind of the idea, and in terms of some of the goals around what we're trying to do, as I mentioned, stability for clients is a major one here. When we were doing releases like 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, because we weren't following semantic versioning, it was really hard for systems administrators to tell kind of how much of a change each version was from one to the next, so they have to go read release notes and not really be able to really tell like how bad the changes were. So this does give a lot more stability for people that are building on top of a client, or clients that are building on top of the API. And as I said, it does support more of these alternative use cases. And I'll go into what some of those are, but there are, it's really hard to architect a software application that does everything. It's one of the reasons that Valkyrie exists as well, is to support kind of different back-end options for Samvera, and we're kind of doing the same thing here. And along the way, we're also trying to better standardize our practices. So back in Fedora 3, we used things like Foxaml, the Fedora object XML, which was a kind of a version of METS, is a very Fedora specific thing, and there were all kind of many Fedora customizations that we were doing. In this latest version, we're really trying to do a better job at standardizing. So you'll find if you read through the API docs that they are largely just an amalgamation of a bunch of relatively well-adopted modern web standards. That's kind of the idea. And I'll cover what those standards are and what we're doing. But that's sort of the idea here, is just to kind of standardize around a set of practices. So part of this too, and what's informing our thinking, is how we think about Fedora. And the idea that while this probably isn't true for all Samvera institutions, our thinking is that most people want to have a repository that can have multiple clients communicating with it and doing different things with the data. We'll have a visualization here, and I'll kind of show what I mean, but at the most basic level, this idea that institutions really need their applications to be interoperable, to have data that's used by more than one application or service, and to not have to kind of duplicate everything all over the place and have all kinds of custom applications. And so we're really trying to focus on how can we standardize things so that your repository as Fedora could have multiple client applications, but they're all communicating through the same API and being able to feed the data to different services. So just to think of this from kind of the visual perspective, and this builds up over time. I'm not just showing Fedora as kind of a green can with nothing else going on in this diagram, but you have your Fedora, and Fedora contains basically RDF and binary files. So files are described by RDF, and the files themselves are stored in the file system. You can also, and this is one of the new things in the APIs, there are multiple ways to handle external content. I'll talk about that, but you don't have to store all or any of your files in Fedora's native file system if you don't want to. There is support for external file storage in a number of different scenarios, and I'll go over what those are. Fedora also, this little Wi-Fi symbol here is meant to indicate it does messaging. So the idea here is that there are basically two ways to kind of build integrations on top of Fedora. One is to do it through the API, and the other is to do it through the messaging system. I'll talk a little bit about this, but basically every time you make a change, Fedora emits a message, and you can have applications that act off those messages in a kind of asynchronous manner. We use Apache Camel to do a lot of these workflows, but there are other systems and services that you can do for this. So for example, that's actually how the triple store interaction works in Fedora. So Fedora doesn't have a built-in triple store. Kind of learned some hard lessons from Fedora 3, where we did have a built-in triple store, which is Bulgara, and then Bulgara became kind of unsupported, and it was slow and sluggish, but you couldn't really replace it because it was built into the application. So we've externalized all that. You can use basically any triple store you want. There's been some experimentation with Fuseki and Blazecraft and a few others. But those interactions happen by basically events being emitted from Fedora and the triple store being updated based on those events. So that's one possible interaction model. The API talks about those messages, not really about the external application, but just what kind of messages does Fedora emit and what do they look like, what kind of information do they contain, etc. But there is, of course, the API. That's the focus of the workshop here today. And there's lots of different things that you might want to have interacting with Fedora at that level. Website I'm just using here generically. I mean, that's in a large part your kind of Samvera site could be thought of in that way. But also, if you're using IIIF, you could have a IIIF image server that's working against the Fedora API. Potentially, you have workflow tools. There have been folks that have been experimenting with things like Archivematica, different kind of packaging tools, getting data in and out of Fedora. We have an import-export tool that lets you put data in and get data out in bags, for example. That would all happen through the API. Potentially also things like research data. If you're using Vivo, you want to have a profiling system. We're really interested in seeing if there are institutions, and actually I believe Texas A&M is already doing this, but having an integration between Vivo and Fedora, for example, where you might have researcher profiles and pulling data from Fedora on publications and data sets and things like that. So lots of possible integrations here, and this would all kind of happen through that API layer. I mentioned there's an import-export tool, so that's actually also how you would get your data out. So if you were migrating to a different system, for example, or to a later version of Fedora that required a migration, there's an import-export tool you can use to get the data out in kind of serialized RDF. Some options there. You can use Bagit and a few other things. Export to a file system, or maybe you're using a distributed digital preservation system, Deepin, Chronopolis, AP Trust. There's lots of them out there. They often transact in Bagit bags, and so you can get your data out in that kind of a format, or into another Fedora. I'm not focusing on this today, but there is a kind of separate application that's been built primarily by the folks at Johns Hopkins, but others in the community are interested in this as well. It's called the API Extension Framework, or APIX, and this is just kind of this proxy layer that sits between the Fedora API and external clients and can do kind of interesting data transformations and things like that, just proxying kind of connections and providing extra features that Fedora doesn't provide natively as part of the API, but it can make it kind of look like or appear that those functions are supported by proxy connections to different services. So if you're interested in any of that kind of stuff, I know APIX isn't leveraged very much in the Samvera community, but I know the stakeholders of that particular application would be interested in wider adoption. So I'm always happy to point you in the right direction there if you want to find out more about it. But so that's how we're kind of thinking of Fedora in the ecosystem as just kind of one component amongst many, and trying to make it possible to kind of standardize those interactions. If we're talking about the specification itself, it really just comes down to these kind of 5 major areas. So these are the Fedora features, or the Fedora services, I guess you could say, that we've decided to standardize on. And I'll walk through each of these in some detail. This is kind of the focus today, to talk a little bit about what we're doing with these things, how things have changed a little bit between 4 and 5, some of the new features that we're adopting. Resource management, your basic CRUD, create, read, update, delete operations. For some time in the Fedora 4 lifecycle, this has been the linked data platform, which is a W3C World Wide Web Consortium specification, kind of an interaction model for how clients and servers can interact with one another on the web using linked data. And so that's primarily how resource management happens in Fedora. It's kind of in line with this specification. And we'll go through just kind of basic resource creation scenarios so you can kind of see how that works. The versioning paradigm is brand new, so Fedora 4 supported versioning, but in a custom way. We are now, as of the 5.0 release, fully supporting Memento. How many of you have heard of Memento? Familiar with this standard at all? All right, so maybe something worth looking up. This is something Herbert von Sompel's been involved with, and a few others in that sort of community around building a versioning model for the web. And the idea behind Memento is you can go to a Memento compatible server and say, give me this website as near as possible to this date time, and supply that basically as just kind of the arguments in the URL. And if the server is Memento compliant, it'll give you back what you asked for. And so it's less about creating versions and more about how versions are stored and served up. But Fedora is now fully implementing Memento as part of the API. And I've got a good chunk of the workshop where I'll just walk through some of those because that is brand new stuff. Authorization hasn't changed much. So we've been using web access control for some time. This is another W3C specification. I don't actually think it's a full spec yet, but it's being implemented by some major projects, including Solid of MIT. But so web access control really is just a way of using linked data, RDF, to do authorization. So there is a distinction here between authentication and authorization. Authentication is when you supply a username and password and the server tells you whether or not you have access, and authorization is when you've already entered the server and now you're kind of discovering what you have permission to do. So can you create, can you write, can you delete, etc. So Fedora assumes that authentication happens at a layer above the application. Many institutions have systems like LDAP or Shibboleth or some kind of campus-wide sign-on system, or the application like Samvera has features to handle that kind of stuff. And so Fedora kind of assumes you've been pre-authenticated, and once you're in the system, then you can apply some authorization rules to dictate what users or what groups of users have what kind of access rights to resources or trees of resources. So that's been in Fedora for a while, but it's we're basically just bringing this completely up to spec with the latest web access control spec. Notifications, again, we've been doing notifications for a while. This is how Fedora emits messages that you can act off of, or that applications can act off of. We're aligning here with activity streams. I think it's the 2.0. That's all written up in the specification. I'm not going into a lot of detail on that in today's workshop, but you can look up that spec if you're interested in how Fedora does messaging. And we've standardized on binary resource fixity as well, so checksums basically. There's a couple of types, and I'll go into those, but we're basically using HTTP headers primarily as the way to kind of do fixity. And Fedora, the application itself can do fixity checks, but the API also has ways, especially if you're using external content and you're running fixity on that content already, and you don't need Fedora to do fixity. Many modern file systems kind of already do fixity, so there's ways to kind of transmit that information and check it. So those are the 5 main components, and I'll just be kind of walking through kind of how all that stuff works, and you're welcome to kind of follow along and let me know if there's any issues with any of that stuff. To start out with, just going to do some basic resource management stuff. I think I've already covered this, but basically we're just kind of using and extending the linked data platform, making some optional features of LDP mandatory, and again, we're kind of expanding the support for external content. So I'll be able to show some of that stuff as we get going here. I'm going to start up the application, and if you'd like to follow along, I encourage you to do the same. So basically here, I've got my jar file, and Mac and Windows, this should just run for you. I know I was talking to Andrew Woods, who's the tech lead, and he's got a Linux system, and he had to basically run the Java jar command on the file system, or on the command line to get this to run. But if anyone has any issues, let me know. I'm just going to start this up. And so this is basically just a snapshot of. This is just a snapshot of the work that's currently going on. So we're in the middle of a second code sprint to get us to a release candidate for 5.0. So you can expect that later this year. But this is sort of the current version of that code base. And it should, when you hit start, just load it in your browser, or if you just go to localhost 8080, you should find it running. So it gives you kind of a button to go to the REST endpoint. I'm just going to and take you to the top level of the repository. So if you haven't really seen this screen before, this is basically just an HTML version of the, or display of the REST API. So it's not a separate application, it's just using content negotiation and displaying a kind of restricted version of the API rendered in HTML. So all the stuff that we're going to be doing here is really interacting directly with the API, we're just doing it in a user interface rather than using curl, but you could also do it that way. So here's where I kind of flip back and forth between slides a little bit. This particular section of the workshop is stuff that I've done before, so I'm going to run through it relatively quickly, but this is just kind of demonstrating the basic functionality of resource creation and management, and then we'll get to some of the new stuff immediately following that. But what I'm going to do here is just go to kind of the top level of the repository and create a basic container. And so if you're not super familiar with how Fedora works, again, this isn't really sort of an introduction to Fedora workshop, more of a kind of what's new with the 5.0 workshop. But you really just have two types of content. You have containers and binaries. Containers are composed of RDF, that's in compliance with the LDP specification. And they're really just kind of metadata objects. So they don't have any kind of files attached to them. And then when you want to upload a file, that's called a binary in this context. And so really, there's just those two types of things in your repository. Drag this over so I can flip back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to create and manage a couple of containers and binaries, and just put your hand up if I'm going too fast here, if you'd like to get a little bit more detail on any of this stuff. But I'm just going to create a container here and just call it basic at the top level. So see over here, I have this little toggle for container and binary. I'm going to do container. If you don't supply any kind of an identifier, Fedora will generate one for you, but it'll basically be just a bunch of letters and numbers, kind of an opaque, randomly generated identifier. For the purposes of just making this an easy demo, we're going to be using really easy identifiers, but probably you have your own local practices, or Samvera has its own kind of application-specific way of handling Fedora identifiers. Yeah, what am I calling this one? Basic. You can ignore this little RDF box. That's just there if you wanted to like pre-populate the container with a set of properties. We're just going to create it with the default properties, so no particular descriptive metadata, just the kind of system properties. And if I click the add button here, really what you get is a really minimum container, so it's just the most basic kind of resource, and it has really basic kind of system properties, things like when it was created, who created it. We're just in as like the bypass administrator right now. We're not using any kind of authentication. Last modified, who modified it, whether you can write to it, and because this is RDF, it has a whole bunch of different types, and most of these come directly out of things like the linked data platform. So it is an RDF source, it is a container, and it is a basic container. So there are kind of subcategories of container, not in the scope of this workshop, but feel free to dive into the linked data platform if you want to know more about container types. But this is basically just a really simple resource, and now we can kind of do some manipulation there. So, for example, here I could create another container contained within this one. Just call this one collection. So you can see at the top the path will kind of continue there. So we're at /rest/basic/collection. So that's essentially the URI that Fedora is using, and the path where this is located within Fedora. You can of course use your own sort of public-facing URIs. So often folks aren't using the kind of internally generated URIs as the one that they're making publicly available. Your application could generate one, or you could use a service, arcs, handles, DOIs, that kind of thing. and just map them onto the internal Fedora identifiers. Or you can use these, that's of course, another option. So from here, I'm just going to, there's a little breadcrumb trail that makes it easy to kind of navigate this stuff. I'm just going to go back to the basic container, the first one I created, and then create another container called images. So if I go up here, I've got home basic collection. I'm just going to click on basic to go back, and then call this one, create a new container here called images. And you can see too, it'll tell you the kind of child containers. So we're creating just kind of a really basic tree of resources here. So I'll create that. And so now we have /rest/basic/images. So haven't really added much. We haven't added any descriptive metadata. Haven't added any files. Just creating some really basic containers. But then we'll go ahead and add a little bit more here. And there's some details in these slides that are there for your information. I'm not going to read every bullet here, but it's just kind of describing how these interactions happen. But these slides will remain available to you afterwards if you want to use them as a reference. But I'm going to go to the images container, which is where I am now, and I'm going to upload a binary file. So just show the difference between containers and binaries. Pretty basic. You can upload anything you want. It's not going to display it in the browser. Just whatever small image you might have kind of hanging around on your hard drive is totally fine. I'm just going to call this one mountain. I set an image of a mountain from this region, and I'll put that up there and then kind of do some operations on that. But I'm going to flip over here from container to binary, give it an identifier, so I'm just going to call this one mountain, and then I'm going to browse for the file. So I just have this in the workshop folder. So this nice local mountain, add that. So you can see the screen changes a little bit, so when you put a binary file in there, you get these buttons here. So if I want to, I can download that file. It'll so save it to my download folder, and then maybe I want to open that up, and there you go, and it saves the file name too. It records some basic information, so it takes the file name and stores it as a property, and so it can use that file name when it gives the file back to you. Does some basic kind of detection to determine that it's a JPEG, and it does, so whenever you ingest a file, it does calculate the SHA-1 checksum and use that as both as for the fixity reasons, but also as a path for storing that file. So when I upload a file, Fedora calculates the SHA-1. You can see it down here. It's this number, and then if you were to go on the file system itself, in the binaries directory, you could actually find that file using its checksum. That's how it's stored on the file system. And since everything's on here, I should actually be able to find that. So as soon as you spin up the application, it creates this srepo4 data directory, and there is a srepo binary directory, and then it basically just does kind of a pair tree of the checksum. So we can see this starts with the digits 49. Now here I have a folder called 49, and if I go down there, that's my file. So that's how it's actually stored on the file system if you want to know how to actually go get your files back. It's not doing anything really weird with them. It's just calculating the SHA-1 and using that as a way to kind of store the file. Now, SHA-1 is not a secure algorithm anymore, and there are ways you can actually calculate and store other checksum values if you want to have something more secure. The application is really just using this, not so much for security, but as a method for very quickly generating a path with which to store the file. And what that means, of course, is if you upload the same file twice, it only stores it once. Unless it has two different checksums, in which case you probably have a problem. But if it's the same file by checksum, it will only store it once and just point to it from however many places you reference that file. And if you click the fixity button, it will actually run a fixity check on that file. So it'll recalculate the SHA-1, compare it to what's stored, and tell you, hey, it was successful, and here's the SHA-1. And I'll show you later how you can supply and ask for other checksums, but that's just the default. Okay, so that's creating containers and binaries. Now we're just going to do a quick update. So Fedora has a built-in Sparkle update endpoint, so that's like an RDF query language. You can add RDF properties. You can do it in a variety of ways, but this is one way to add properties to a file. So this would be if you have RDF descriptive metadata, this is one way to add it. Of course, if you're using your Samvera application, all this stuff is kind of being done for you, but this is kind of under the hood how things work. So what I'm going to do here is just add a property. I'm going to use the EBU core ontology to add a width property to this image of 100. So just something really basic. And the way I'm going to do that is just copy this delete insert where statement, and then go to this mountain resource. And if I scroll down, I've got this update properties box. It templates in a bunch of ontologies, metadata ontologies, so that you don't have to go find the right kind of URIs for that stuff and add it. So if you look down here, EBU core should already be in this list, so it's already kind of registered with Fedora. It's basically right there. So we don't have to go find that. We can just use it and just use the prefix EBU core. So at the bottom there's this little delete insert where template. I'm just going to highlight that and delete it, and then paste in what I've done before. So that's just templating that's there to make it easier for you. And if I hit the update button, you should see up here, I've got a file name, a MIME type, and the width property that I just added. So we're basically adding, I guess this might be considered technical metadata, or maybe descriptive, to a file. And so there's kind of a thin wrapper around that file that contains these metadata properties. And we're not really talking about sort of data modeling and metadata in today's session. There are certainly some best practices around what types of metadata you add to files versus which types of metadata you add to containers. But Fedora will allow you to kind of add properties to any of the resources that it manages. So that's create, update, and read, because we're viewing these things. Now we'll demo delete, and then we've basically done all the basic resource management functions. So delete works as you would expect. Through the UI, there's not even sort of a, are you sure you want to do this prompt? And it's not there's no kind of recycle bin or anything. It's just kind of, purging the file. Now, your application, of course, can put in safety mechanisms, and I'm sure Samvera has ways to manage that kind of stuff. From the interface, if you tell Fedora to delete something, it just deletes it. And so there is a big red button marked delete, and if you hit it, it does indeed do what it says. If I hit my back button now, I'm sure my browser is just caching this. If I refresh, that file is gone. And what it leaves in its place is what, I'm not sure if this is unique to Fedora, but certainly the term we use here is tombstone. So this goes to kind of a linked data best practice around not reusing URIs. Technically, if this is a public-facing repository and you created something and created a URI and published that URI, other people might reference that and use it, so you shouldn't reuse that URI. If you published a data set with a URI and you deleted the data set and replaced it with a picture of a cat, then whoever's research referred to that is probably not going to be super happy with you. Yeah?
Is the tombstone tied in with the Memento version?
No, the tombstone predates the Memento stuff, and it's not related to that spec. It's its own thing. You can get rid of them too. So tombstones in a development environment are just annoying because you're creating stuff and then you're deleting stuff and then you have to keep finding new URIs because you can't reuse them. So you can actually just run and it's documented in the API documentation. You can run a delete command on the command line to just purge all of the tombstones. So you can, in fact, reuse URIs if you want to. But Fedora just kind of encourages you not to from the public repository perspective. And so the nice thing here too is there is the appropriate HTTP response code. So if a machine were to navigate to this resource, it doesn't just say it doesn't exist, it says it's gone. So there's a specific code that tells the machine that there used to be something here, and here's some information about it, but it's gone now. So that's just good to do, but again, if you're working in a development environment, tombstones are super annoying, and you can just kind of purge them when you need to kind of constantly create and delete stuff because you're testing and whatnot. But that's the functionality. There's a little bit of info there. Any questions about that stuff before we get to the external content? Okay, pretty good on time. I don't know that there's prescribed breaks, but I figured 3:30 is probably a good time to take a break, so at the halfway point. So we'll press on here a little bit. So this section gets a little bit more technical because in order to enable external content, you have to do a few configuration steps. I could imagine this being a little smoother when we do the 5.0 release, but they are really kind of one-time things that you would do when you set up your server. So external content is handled, and I can probably make this a little bigger. Through this stuff. So there is basically a link header that you use to specify external content. This is all documented in the API spec, so if you're kind of wondering where to find this information, if you look in the specification, there is a section on external binary content. So I won't read through all this, but if you want to get the details, it's all in here. I'm just kind of summarizing it. But essentially, you can use a link header to refer to external content. And the target of the link is the URI for the file that you're pointing to. And what we've specified is handling for 3 different kinds of external files. And so I'll kind of go over what those are. There's copy, redirect, and proxy. So if you use copy, the Fedora is going to actually go out and fetch that file and copy it into the repository, and then it's going to treat it as a normal binary file in the Fedora. So that's one way that it's going to go out, fetch the file, and then store a copy of it in Fedora. The other way is to do a redirect. So you refer to the file wherever it is, and then when a client goes to access that file, they actually get redirected to wherever that file exists, and so they would be aware that they're getting redirected out of Fedora. And then the third type is proxy, which is where Fedora is basically proxying where that file is. So the client thinks it's getting the file out of Fedora, when in fact Fedora is going and fetching that file, externally, but it's kind of doing a proxy connection there. So it's those kind of 3 different types: this copy, redirect, and proxy for handling external content relationships. And there's different ways that you can do each of those. So I'm just going to do a quick setup here to kind of demo how this works, and you're welcome to kind of follow along. Again, this does start to get a little bit more technical, but I'm going to demo everything up front if you'd rather not kind of do all this locally. But the first thing you have to do is create this text file with basically allowed domains for external files. And this is really just a safety feature, so people can't kind of willy-nilly, put in external files in any domain and send users kind of off being redirected to malicious sites and things like that. So you could basically create a file that specifies all of the domains within which you will allow external content to come from. And so you would set this up, and you could make changes to it over time, but this would be something you would set up for your users to be able to access. There's some documentation there as well that kind of tells you how you would do that. But so you create this file called allow.txt, and then you add the full path to a local file directory or website or whatever. So when we talk about external content, it could be like like web content, like an HTTP URI, but it could also be like a local file handle that you want to specify as well. So there's support for those different scenarios. So you can kind of do whatever you want on your local machine. What I've done is basically just I'm going to create a file, and I've already created it here, but I just created this file called allow.txt, and the entire contents of that file are just kind of 2 domains where I'm kind of allowing external content to be pulled from. So the first is the full path to my kind of workshop directory, so obviously this is going to look different on your local machine. It does have to be the full path, so you can't use like a relative path or anything in this scenario. And then otherwise I'm just using, I'm just going to pull my own picture off the DuraSpace website to put in the repository. But you can specify any kind of website domain that you'd like to allow external content to come from. So I basically have just created that allow.txt file and put it in my main directory where my application is stored. And then I'm actually going to shut down the application and start it from the command line with an argument that points to that text file. It's kind of laid out here how you would do that, but you basically just run like the Java jar command to open the web app, but you supply this one extra kind of FC repo external content allowed with the full path to, again, it's not a relative path, it's the full path to wherever that allow.txt file is stored. So I'll demo this up here. I realize this can be a little bit kind of difficult to do in a demo setup, and normally we would have something a little bit more packaged for you to do, but unfortunately since we're doing, since you have to have this file kind of stored locally, then you have to do a little bit of knowing what paths you're using. If you happen to be kind of working on the command line and you're in the directory for your files and you're not sure what directory that is, at least if you're running kind of Mac or Linux, you can do like a pwd command to tell you kind of what is the path of where you're currently at. But I'll demo this up here and kind of show you how this works. So I had some notes, so I didn't have to. So this is the command that I'm going to run. It's basically just opening up this this jar file and referencing the allow.txt. First I'm going to shut this one down, so I'm going to hit the stop button on my current web app and exit that. So then I'm going to go on the command line. So you want to be in the directory where your jar file is located to run this command. And again, you need to have Java 8 and that kind of stuff installed. So that's the command, and if I run that, it'll basically just pop this open with that additional argument. And now when I hit the start button, my terminal here is going to be my console. But if you actually were to read through this, you would see the kind of reference to loading that allow.txt file on startup, and then it'll once again kind of boot into the repository. If you don't do that, then it won't actually allow you to do the external content stuff. Anyway, so I'll demo it up here. If you do have trouble with this, don't worry. The rest of the workshop you won't need to have. This is the only section where you will need to have the external content set up. We'll go back to kind of the normal stuff after. So I basically just have slides here demoing the 3 scenarios. Again, these are here for your reference too if you want to go back later and try this when you have a little bit more time, but I'll demo these up here. The first thing I'm going to do, so I'm moving to kind of doing some work on the command line here. I'm going to do a curl command to add this using this first one. I'm using the proxy scenario, and I'm using a local file. So I'm going to refer to this test file, test.ping that I have sitting in my folder. I think this is just the Berlin skyline because we're doing a camp in Berlin next month, and I was looking for fun t-shirt designs. So this is, I'm going to upload that file, and then I'm using this external content link header, telling it to handle it as a proxy, that it's a ping, and then to put that file into basically create a new file called test proxy local file, just to make it really obvious. So that's all that's going on here. So if I just kind of copy and paste this, let me open up a new terminal window to do that. So you see it gives you the 201 created, that file was created successfully, and then if I go back and kind of refresh go back to the top level of my repository, you'll see I have this test proxy local file, and if I click on that, here this is the file, and if I go see what information information this gives you, but if I click the download content button, I'll just save this. It will go grab that file and then deposit it locally, and then I can open it up. So that's the proxy scenario. That's files stored externally, and Fedora is proxying the connection between the client and the file location. Any questions about how that works? Yeah.
How does Fixity work for proxies?
Yeah, so it doesn't right now. Like when I hit this Fixity button, I get like bad checksum and that kind of stuff. I was actually looking into that this morning, and it's something that I'm not sure if when we do the final 5.0 release there might be some more robust support there. You can definitely supply a checksum and store it with that file, but yeah, right now Fedora, if it wants to run the checksum for that, it's not going to be able to checksum that file. So then there's the redirect scenario, which is pretty similar to proxy, but here I'm going to use an online URL, so I basically just pulled my own headshot off of the DuraSpace website. That's what this link is, and I specify DuraSpace as the domain. And then here I'm just doing the redirect scenario and loading this into Fedora as a test redirect remote file. So once again here, I'm going to clear this out. So it'll create that file for me, and then if I go back to my repository, I now have this test redirect remote file that I've just created, and I can download that as well. And in this case, you see it actually does just redirect me to that URL. So it's not trying to like proxy that connection or anything like that. It's just a straight redirect to where that location is on the website. But as you might expect there, Fedora doesn't have the capability to checksum that file. It's sitting on another server, somewhere else, and so there's no sort of checksumming involved in that scenario. Although that's something because I didn't have time this morning to look too deeply into this. There may be some more robust support for Fixity in general when we're doing kind of external content, but definitely in terms of Fedora as the application's capabilities to kind of run a checksum on a file that's sitting on a remote host, it doesn't do that.
Dave, I'm curious, what was the use case for adding that feature? Basically, do you know?
So this came up during the specification conversations, and there were a number of people in the editorial group that were interested in external content. I think Ben Armenter at Columbia had a pretty strong use case for it, so I'm going to be talking later about alternate implementations, but Ben's working on one called Cavendish, and Cavendish is built on a triple store with no kind of internal file storage. So he has a pretty strong use case for basically using Fedora to manage the metadata and relationships, but he wants to have the files stored somewhere else, just kind of managed separately, probably checksum separately, so not needing Fedora to actually checksum those files. A lot of modern file systems do checksumming anyway, but just having Fedora kind of manage that content either in a proxy or redirect type scenario. So there's probably more detail there around like the use cases for those particular types of content, but I know a lot of that did come out of those kind of discussions amongst the specification editors around kind of being able to support scenarios where we want to have content stored outside of the repository but still have Fedora be able to kind of know about that content and refer to it. So the third use case here is copy, and this one is really as the name kind of implies, going out and grabbing that content and copying it directly into the repository. So this might be a case where you don't have the file kind of on your local hard drive, but you know where it is, and you want to go out and fetch it and put it into Fedora rather than just kind of having a pointer to it. So I'm using the same kind of image that I was just using but I'm doing a copy here instead of a proxy or a redirect. Oops. So if I run that command and then go back home here, I now have this copy remote file. And this one is a little different because it is actually, now this file is stored in Fedora. So if I go save this file, it's not going to go to the website, it's going to actually store the file locally. And it will, of course, be able to run Fixity on it because it has the file locally. It's gone out and copied the file into Fedora and has that local file stored. So it works a little bit different than the other two scenarios. Yeah.
Is downloading that file locally like a blocking operation, or does it get it eventually?
Oh, that's a good question. I assume it's a blocking operation because I think you're just, I'm not 100% sure, but I would assume that's a blocking operation because I don't think there's any machinery there going on in the background where it's kind of queuing that up and providing it asynchronously. So, yeah.
Could you write an integration that would do that with like a Rails application if you have something that does backgrounding jobs?
Sure.
The way that it's configured now, would it be relatively painless to do so?
I would assume so. I mean, the file, so if you have it stored, and you're thinking of that scenario for stuff that's stored, like you've done a copy and you've brought it in and you want someone to hit download, but then be able to come back later when it's, well, because this is really, if you put the file in this way, it's really not that different than had you had the file locally and just uploaded it and put it in Fedora. Because it's stored in the Fedora file system. And so I think some folks are already doing that kind of stuff. Like I know Michigan is doing some work with Globus as a way of kind of being able to request large files for downloads and things like that, so you don't have to just sort of pull it down over HTTP synchronously. So yeah, without having all the details, it doesn't seem like it would be that difficult to write an application that could handle that. And in fact, probably an APIX plugin would be able to do that, but also a Rails application or something within the Samvera framework could do that too. Just something in the middle there so that it's not a blocking operation. So those are the three types of external content, and as I said, this is all documented pretty well here in the specification that'll tell you kind of how all of these things work and how servers can advertise support for these things and how to handle them. So certainly encourage you to go looking a little bit more in the API docs if you're kind of interested in these scenarios. I think it can provide a lot of utility for people that are want to use Fedora particularly for metadata and relationship management, but maybe have use cases where files are very large, or just you have your own kind of hardware and you're not that interested in moving files around. And I do think over time this is going to become a more and more common scenario, and it lines up a little bit with, how many of you are familiar with the Oxford Common File Layout work? Maybe a few of you have heard of this going on, maybe heard the words. Yeah. So again, I don't have a section in this presentation for it, but that is kind of an offshoot effort. It's not directly related to Fedora, although it kind of came out of the Fedora community, but they're trying to define basically just kind of a structure for how files and folders can lay on a file system, on any file system, with a preservation-centric kind of focus. But one of their ideas is that applications change a lot faster than file systems, and so if you have your files kind of stored neatly in a preservation-centric way on a file system of your choice, and you have your application like Fedora that's really just kind of pointing to those files and managing them, but not actually kind of storing them internally, then Fedora can go away, and you can do upgrades, and you don't ever have to like move those files around. And I think increasingly as we deal with larger and larger file sets and files, file sizes are only getting bigger. And once we start getting into terabytes and petabytes of data, you're just not going to want to migrate those files every time you upgrade your application and it requires a data migration. In a lot of cases, you're already doing data migrations every 5 years, 10 years. I mean, it's not a really long cycle. I mean, they do become increasingly more difficult to manage the more content you're managing. So I think there's a really strong use case for having content stored externally in some preservation-friendly way, or just a way that you're pretty confident is going to outlast your applications, and then just have the applications handle your metadata and your relationships and kind of point to those files. So I think that's where a lot of those use cases come from, and maybe some others in the community that I'm less aware of, but I do think there's some utility for a couple of these scenarios that we'll probably see. There's certainly some institutions that are represented on the specification editors group that are interested in this kind of stuff. Any other questions about that before we talk a bit about versioning?
The Oxford, that also takes into account like the notion of like rebuilding from binary, right? Like,
Yeah, actually,
sure.
that's, I was just going to mention that's one of the driving use cases as well. Yeah, so if you go to ocfl.io, you can find the specification itself. And you may also, if you want a quick rundown of it, I did a presentation on this at iPres just a couple of weeks ago. So there's a short paper that does a pretty good job of explaining it. And I can just put this in the resources page for the workshop if you want to go find it. But there is there's a short paper in a presentation that kind of covers OCFL that you might be kind of interested in. But yeah, the gist of it is they're trying to develop it's a file layout. It's not specifically to do with file systems because it's kind of agnostic about your storage hardware and how you use things. And the idea is just defining a file and folder layout that also handles things like versioning and fixity, but also crucially that idea of being able to rebuild the repository from the file system. And so if that's the kind of use case that you have, there's good Fedora representation in that group, and I know, perhaps not coincidentally, the folks at Oxford, the university, are interested potentially in having a Fedora that is compliant with OCFL in some respect. It may be an API implementation, or it may kind of it could be an API implementation that really heavily leverages external content. I can see that being a pretty strong scenario there, but that work hasn't really begun yet because the specification isn't totally complete yet. But the timeline there is pretty soon, so you can expect an OCFL spec by, I think, a draft by the end of this year, full spec next year, and a test suite and some implementations and things like that. So it's an effort worth following, I think, if you have kind of a preservation focus at your institution, and if you have a lot of files and you're kind of concerned about moving data through time. It seems like a pretty valuable effort. All right, we've got a break coming up here pretty soon. I can maybe touch on a little bit of the versioning stuff, and then we can pause for a break and then come back and kind of round things out and take a look at some of the alternate implementation stuff as well. Any other questions on anything we've covered so far before I jump into this stuff? I'll probably end up kind of pausing partway through this because the versioning stuff is all pretty new, and so I have a lot of kind of examples here from the documentation on how to do certain things within versioning. So yeah, so I know it sounds like most folks here are not familiar with Memento, but if you go to I think it's just at like mementoweb.org. Go time travel. So yeah, mementoweb.org will kind of give you a sense of how this stuff works. It has a nice little interface here for kind of exploring it and some information about the project and the API. But essentially this is kind of a specification that's really focused on being able to retrieve versions of resources on the web as near as possible to specific dates and times. So they use this what they're calling a time gate interaction model, which I'm pretty sure is a sci-fi reference. It would not surprise me. But the idea here is that there is kind of a time gate, and you specify, hey, I want this resource as near as possible to this date and time, and the server understands that interaction model and can comply by serving up that resource. So just streamlining a lot of this kind of web archiving sort of stuff, and so we've decided to implement this in Fedora because it makes sense as a kind of version standard to go with. So I'm going to do kind of a few demos here around versioning. So you can keep your server running, or you can start a new instance of it. It doesn't really matter. We're done with the external content stuff, so even if you didn't do that part of the demo, you can still participate in this. This part is not dependent on any of the external content stuff. So I'm going to jump back and forth here a little bit from the UI and the command line because there's some support in both for this. One thing, and I'll link to this. I think it's actually linked at the bottom of these slides, but we are working on updating the documentation for the 5.0 release, and so there is a space for that, and it does cover a lot of this new functionality. For example, there's a full kind of section here on versioning that describes how all that works if you want to dig into the details of it. But what I'll do here for now is just kind of, I'm going to create a new container at the top level and just call it version test, and then I'm going to do some kind of operations on it and demonstrate how this all works. So I'm just going to click the home button, and under container here, I'm just going to, again, call this one version test. So it doesn't do anything yet, but I'm going to do some operations here to demonstrate how some of this versioning stuff works. If you scroll down, you will see this enable versioning button. This is actually an earlier cut of the 5.0 release. I believe what we're going to do in the full release is just make everything versionable by default. Now, something being versionable doesn't mean that it has versions, it just means that it has the capability of being versioned. The way the system was set up right now is that in order for something to be capable of having versions, you had to make it a versionable container, and that implies adding some link headers and defining it as a versionable resource. But we're just going to enable that by default because there's not really a strong use case for having stuff that's not versionable in the repository. Although there may be, but we're not aware of any use cases where we wouldn't want to have things be capable of being versioned. And certainly in the 4.7.5 and anything earlier, everything is capable of being versioned, so that wouldn't be a major change. But so for now, I'm just going to click this enable versioning button on the resource, and when I do that, it'll now give me the capability of creating new versions and viewing the memento. So the way the spec defines it, a version is called a memento, and you can go view all the mementos associated with that resource. But what I'm going to do here, so if I click create version, that creates a snapshot at a point in time. So versions are immutable. The idea being that you create a snapshot of a point in time of that resource, and then you can't change that version or that memento anymore. You can still make changes to the original resource and create new versions as needed, but the versions themselves are kind of a fixed point in time. So you can delete them or you can restore them, but you can't actually modify them. And so if you were to click on, and it uses a specific format, an RFC format for date time. You can see that here. And so if I click on that, you can see it'll take me to kind of every resource has this versioning endpoint, this FCR versions, and then after that, each version has its own URI that is based on the date time. So you can see this is 2018, 1009, basically the date and time in which I created that version. That's how it names that version. So previously in the for line, you had to give versions labels. So that's a change. Instead of labeling versions, versions get their own URIs and their own labels essentially in compliance with the way Memento wants the date time to be used. And if you, this is kind of blank, but there's this other resources thing here. And if you click the gray spot, no, if you click this, it's going to take you to the resource. But if you click the actual gray bar here, it'll show you what that resource looked like. That's the snapshot of that resource, basically. So there's not much there because we didn't do much to it. But if I were to go back, so if I just click on this link to version test, or you can use your back button, or you can use the breadcrumb trail, but if you go back to this version test resource, we can do some operations on it, like for example, adding some basic metadata. So here I'm just adding kind of a title. And again, the way you do that is going to the update properties box and scrolling down, clearing out these last few lines, and then adding the insert DC title, clicking the update button. So I do that, I've got a title for the resource now. If I wanted to, I could create another version snapshot to capture that I've made a change to this resource. So if I click create version, I've now got those, I have 2 versions now, and I could explore these. So I can go take a look at my earlier version and see that it has no title associated with it. If I go back and click on my newer version, I can see that it does have the title. So I basically just created snapshots at particular points in time that represent versions of that resource, one with the title, one with it. So pretty basic, not so different that compared to what you could do before, but just the mechanism for creating and managing versions has changed to be compliant with Memento. Right, and this is just some notes. One note is that in this cut, there's no way to actually restore a version, but that functionality will be in the full 5.0 release. Things are still slightly under development there, but you can do everything else, just there's not restore functionality yet. So then these next few slides are really just trying to demonstrate some of the stuff that you can do on the command line, and a lot of this is pulled out of the documentation on versioning. And so this is just to kind of show, if you were building, updating a Samvera client, for example, to work with this new kind of versioning API, some of the different kind of ways things have changed since the last release. So for example, there's a couple of things you can do. One is you can just get a list of all the available versions for a particular resource. See if I can make this a little bit bigger and then I'll demo it. Yeah, so if you do basically just a get request against the versions endpoint, so that FCR versions, at the end of that URI, then you will get back a list of all of the versions that are available for that particular resource. So if I copy this, so it gives me back, the different prefixes here, but if you go to the very bottom of this, you'll see there's 2 LDP contains references to the 2 versions that we created. So those URLs, if you were to copy and paste these into your browser, you would get to that particular version.
Does Memento have the notion, I see on that time travel UI that you can specify a singular update. Does it have the notion of like time tracking?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not super familiar with the details of the Memento spec. The way that we have it implemented here, yeah, so there's a link here to the date-time negotiation algorithm. So it looks like you can supply a value that's earlier, a value that's Yeah, well, the short answer is I'm not sure. There's some links here to go a little bit deeper into the specification. So if Memento allows it, then Fedora would allow it because we're just aligning with the spec. So I'll certainly look into this after, but maybe just update the wiki page with some details there. But there are some links to the details of the spec, but it's whatever the Memento datetime algorithm allows, and for that.
I was just thinking, I don't like this aspect of OAI. I don't like OAI for image in general, but it has that notion of like you supply the beginning and get the repository.
Yeah, my understanding of Memento is you kind of give it a date time and it responds with like the closest to that particular date time. Yeah, I'm not actually sure if it would allow you to give it a.
Then get back on this,
Yeah, because it's not usually, the idea is not really to give you like a list of versions so much as it is to give you like the one that you want based on time. But it's a good question and certainly something I'll take a look at after. And you might find your answer if you take a look at the docs, but yeah. So that's, you run that curl command and that gives you kind of a list of all of those versions. And then if you wanted to, you could create a new version with sort of today's, in this moment's date and time. So this command here, this post, is exactly the same as what we did in the UI. When we click the create new version button, this is how you would do that using the command line. So it's a pretty simple, I can't copy paste from here. It's a pretty simple command. You just post to the versions endpoint of the resource that you're trying to version. So if I do that, then I could go back and say, hey, give me a list of all those versions, and see that there is now a third version in that list that we've created. And if I were to explore that in the user interface, I would see essentially the same thing. So if I refresh this, I'll get another version of this. So the UI and the command line here are just, they're doing the exact same thing. They respond in the exact same ways. They'll give you this list of resources, and so you can do it using the UI, or you can do it on the command line, and you'll get the same results. Okay, I think it's probably a good time to take a break. So we're here until, I'd say, something close to 5 o'clock, maybe not right at 5. We'll see how far we get with these things. But I had planned to take about a 15-minute break around here. So why don't we just say we'll break until 3:45? So it's a little bit more than 15 minutes. I'm actually not sure. Maybe someone else knows if there's coffee or snacks or something set up somewhere. Maybe. It should be.
Historically, they're outside 11:40, but I don't know if they got more.
Okay, cool. So, sorry I don't have more information on that, but I'll wander around looking for that stuff too. Yeah, just come back at 3:45. We'll wrap up this stuff and then talk briefly about some of the alternate implementations, and then have a little bit of time for questions at the end, and probably finish up here a little before 5. So, see you back here soon.